So my presentation is centered around human relations. The situation that I used is the police brutality amongst, of course, the African American um, culture here in the United States. And the situation within itself is about the failure of the infrastructure that most of these police organizations are failing to comply with. Their communication is non to is minimum to non-existent, and this is the topic that I chose to cover with this organizational communication project. And this situation is based upon the human relationship that the police authority is lacking in interacting with African Americans in across the nation. So this particular slide, of course, it was something that was very near and dear to me that I wanted to express. And so, uh, of course, I used George Floyd, whom happens to be the center of a huge uh, criminal act that was displayed by an officer that was sworn to protect. And so I am very grateful of the verdict that just came down of guilty on all charges. No, this does not take away the lack of communication that the police precincts across the nation has failed to exhibit. But what it does say is that there is a justice system, there is a jury here in America that will convict a police officer regardless of the lack of communication that he exhibits when interacting with African American people, him, her, she, him, what have you. The jury just bridged the gap, in my opinion, with the lack of organizational communication that is supposed to exist across the police departments here in the nation. So I wanted to define organizational communication as the process of creating and negotiating collective coordinated systems of meaning through symbolic practices oriented toward the achievement of organizational goals. So in this particular slide I put on here, I wanted to ask the question, what has the police communicated to Blacks? They have communicated to us that communicating is not an option. What we're doing, how we're doing it, and why we're doing it is not a discussion. I do know that within that organization, I was never a police officer, but however, I am a veteran. I, served in the military. When I came home, I was about to join the sheriff department. So, and I have a background in criminal justice. So I am very well aware of some of the laws centered around how the police officers are to govern themselves. And there is a lack of communication that is taking place between an officer stopping an African American and either of them being able to go home. So I don't know exactly what it is that is failing us. I truly believe that this is something that individually it needs to be addressed. People need to reassess, the police officers themselves need to reassess what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it. And they also need to be taught, they need to be retrained on how to effectively communicate with someone. Here it is, it says, why is the police failing? 181 Blacks have been murdered by police since the murder of George Floyd. In 2018, 229 Blacks were murdered by police. 765 people were killed by police in 2020, and 28% of them were Black. There is a divide in the infrastructure between the authorities across the nation and when they go into a Black neighborhood or when they pull over a Black person. There is a divide. There is a communication gap. Something is not being done as it should. Something is not being adhered to. The infrastructure that the police authorities have placed among these cops to learn and to practice is not being adhered to. Black Americans are more than twice as likely as white Americans to be killed by police officers. Researchers agree that racism almost certainly plays a role in that disparity, but racism is too broad an explanation to reveal much about the more immediate causes or to point a way to reduce police killings of Black people, like the recent ones in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota. What does this say? Organizational communication. Police precincts across the country all have a common goal, it seems. What they're communicating to us in this nation is that they're trying to kill as many of us as they can. Although this may be an inaccurate statement, the statistics prove otherwise. White officers exert their power, and the practices seem to reach across the nation. Trump, who just left office, was a prime example of an invisible knapsack. The communications within the police organizations is sending a very dangerous message to the world. We are on the brink of a civil war. Unfortunately, Trump led this organization with full hatred, and it trickled downward. He led this nation's from emotions. He led this nation from emotion and not from the best interest of the American people. His dislikes became the nation's prejudicial fuel. Police organizations' key descriptions, as well as the public response. A few of our terms that we've covered here in our chapters. Glass slipper comes to mind, gender accountability, chaos, greenwashing, and microaggression. Killing Blacks have become a common practice of white cops. Interrogating whiteness and organizational communication has been implemented against throughout every precinct in the nation. There is hardly a state that has not undergone turmoil because of a police killing an unarmed Black person. The total number of Blacks dying at the hands of police is an internal error. It is a failure in communication within that particular organization. Most cadets graduating are majority white. A few police are hired killers with a badge, in my opinion. What is being said about organizational communication? The media has provided an outpour of coverage surrounded around this topic. The media also enacts fear. The stories are endless. There have been hundreds of murders, none of them we will ever know anything about. Sometimes the media misleads the masses as well. Their job is to enact fear within the people because it's easier to control someone when they're afraid. Members of the media can't help but mislead on these stories in favor of a narrative of innocent Black men being gunned down by overzealous racist cops. Yet, in many instances, the narrative preferred by the media has not matched up with what actually happened. The most famous cases was the Michael Brown shooting. Over and over, we were told that Brown had been holding his hands up in defense when he was shot. Evidence showed he was reaching for the officer's gun, and the evidence was good enough to convince the Obama Justice Department, hands up, don't shoot, became one of the biggest lies of the year, but it still dies hard even now because of the way the incident was reported, according to Skull. Police need communication skills to be effective leaders in their organizations and communities. This discourse implies that as a nation, the ones assigned to protect and serve are causing the most disturbance. In today's world, it is critical that law enforcement personnel have the interpersonal skills needed to effectively communicate with their peers, supervisors, subordinates, community members, other law enforcement, government, private organizations, and the courts. Communication skills are crucial, especially when investigating crimes, de-escalating situations, building trust with those in the community that they serve, writing internal documents, crime reports, and for those who aspire to assume leadership positions within a law enforcement organization, according to William. The perspective, organizational stories, and power. This is the perspective that I chose. I also chose from the critical communication perspective on leadership. Each precinct across the nation has designed a story to the American people that Black America is tired of hearing. Since 2015, police officers have fatally shot at least 135 unarmed Black men and women nationwide. An NPR investigation has found this out. NPR reviewed police, court, and other records to examine the details of the case. At least 75% of the officers were white. The latest one happened this month in Killeen, Texas, when Patrick Warren Sr., 52, was fatally shot by an officer responding to a mental health call, according to Thompson in 2021. According to rhetoric scholar Wachter Fisher argues that human beings are horoneurons. That's an interesting term. That is storytelling beings. We are storytelling beings. The precincts across the nation need to change their stories. The civil unrest that has been upon us will not flee until the unlawful killings of unarmed Blacks flees. The insurrection of January the 6th, 2021 was a prime example of how, if the organization's infrastructure is tainted, how can the organization exist without blemish? The critical communication perspective on leadership, which is what I chose to indicate in this presentation. It shows that Trump failed the American people miserably. His leadership was a prime example of what organizations worldwide should always stay clear from. His immature mindset has caused more ruin to America's democracy. We must examine the stories of the leaders we place in higher positions. The title remains the same, only the chapter changes. And the chapter of killing unarmed Black Americans across this nation needs to close. And the sources that I chose to cite within this presentation is Why Must the Media Mislead on Police Shootings by Skoll, as well as Police Need Communication Skills to be Effective Leaders in Their Organizations and Communities. This was written by William A. William. Fatal police shootings of unarmed Black people reveal troubling patterns. This was written by C.W. Thompson, as well as our own textbook, Organizational Communication, whose author are Mumby, DK, and Khan. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you.